There we go.
Okay, Johannes, would you like to start, please?
Just 1 second, just to check that nobody, okay. Yeah, so hello, everybody. This is the Open Discourse Net seminar in London. Well, of course, it's not in London, but on the screens. We're very happy to welcome Rodney Jones today, who's gonna talk about his work. The Open Discourse Net seminar is now starting with our regular program. We have talks once a month, every Friday at about 1 to 2, except for one of the sessions, which is in April. We will have talks from Stephanie Snyder, Dawn Knight, Jan Chinkowski, Ricky Dema, Majid Kozravenik, and Richard Bramwell. And if you go to our webpage, which I will just post in the chat, you can see the program. Here we go. DiscourseNet is the new association for discourse studies across countries and languages. Let me point out that we also have reading groups and seminar series in other languages. We have the French reading group seminar. We have a Spanish-Portuguese reading group. We have the English reading group, which is going to meet next Friday. No, in 10 days. And so you're very much welcome to join these events and be part of our community. We encourage you to have a look at our webpage and to consider joining our association, which will be a very valuable contribution to our ongoing activities. With your contribution, you will make possible the running of these events, the webpage, which needs to be maintained, and many other things. We're trying to aim at a hybrid format in the future with this seminar. So hopefully at someday we can also have the opportunity to meet in London somewhere. Obviously this is not possible, still not possible. And we will let you know once the situation is sufficiently positive for us to meet again. So for the time being, we have speakers from around the world, and we're very happy to see Rodney Jones today. We've tried to set up a talk, I think, during the pandemic a year or so, 2 years ago. And so very happy to see that you're there today, and give the floor to Zaspal, who will say a few words about your background.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johannes. Hello, everybody. This is our second session in the Open Discourse Net Seminar London. My name is Jaspal Singh, and together with Johannes Angermüller, Stephanie Schneider, and Michael Kranert, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all of you. Today, it is our great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Rodney Jones from the University of Reading, who will be speaking to us on the topic of visibility and accountability in citizens' encounters with police, an applied linguistic perspective. Rodney is a discourse analyst and interactional sociolinguist who is particularly interested in questions of digital media, surveillance, health, gender and sexuality, intercultural communication, and social activism. Together with Sigrid Norris and the late Ron Scollin, he has developed a unique approach to analyzing discourse in the 21st century, dubbed mediated discourse analysis, or nexus analysis. Nexus analysis allows us to understand instances of discourse as a nexus or a site of engagement, which is, quote, a unique historical and material space where separate practices come together in real time to form an action, unquote. Nexus analysis allows us to grasp discourse contexts as non-simplistic variables in our analysis, and it is therefore particularly well suited to analyzing complex contexts in the digital era. Rodney's numerous books, edited volumes, and journal articles provide us with accessible, detailed, and always reflexive and honest accounts of socially relevant topics of today. Both professional researchers and students will find his various writings incredibly inspirational and beneficial to developing their own ideas. Before becoming professor of sociolinguistics at the University of Reading, Rodney has worked at City University of Hong Kong, where he served as head of Department of English. And I know that Rodney and I share an affinity to the city of Hong Kong and the Hong Kongers' struggle for social and historical justice. Now, before I pass the floor to Rodney, I would like to make everybody aware that we are recording this talk and we will upload it on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be visible, please leave your cameras off. You're welcome to use the chat throughout the talk to type in questions and comments to Rodney, which we will try to address in the Q&A session after his talk. Now, without further ado, please join me and put your hands together to welcome Rodney Jones, who will share some insights into his current work on citizens' encounters with the police. Over to you, Rodney. Thank you.
Thank you, Jespo. That was a really kind introduction, and thank you to Johannes and to all the other members of this community that have invited me to come. I do think I was meant to come something like 2 years ago, but then this pandemic hit and everything seemed to go a bit awry for all of us, and continue, I fear, to go awry for many of us. So let's just spend a moment thinking of all the people who have suffered and died through this pandemic and those who continue to suffer. So before I begin, I do think I should probably give a content advisory. Sometimes they're called trigger warnings. I prefer content advisory because I find the word trigger warning quite triggering in a way. So just to let you know that I will be showing some images and videos of citizens' encounters with police. And as we know, sometimes such encounters can be violent, and so there will be some violence portrayed in the material that I'll be showing you today. So just be prepared for that. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is part of my wider interest in surveillance, and I've been sort of researching and publishing on surveillance for the past 5 or 6 years. Usually when we think of surveillance, we think of the powerful monitoring the less powerful. So surveillance cameras or internet companies surveilling us while we're online, or government surveillance. But today I want to talk about what happens when less powerful people actually have the technological means to gaze back at the powerful, or what Steve Mann and his colleagues have referred to as surveillance. Specifically, what I want to focus on is how people use video cameras in mobile phones to discursively manage visibility and accountability in their encounters with police. In many places in the world, as you know, citizens' encounters with police can be quite contentious and sometimes even dangerous. And how contentious and how dangerous these encounters may be often depends on what kinds of citizens are involved, as I'm sure you've noted from the media. For example, in May of 2020 in the US, George Floyd had an encounter with the police, which ended with police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. As we know, Floyd died. But the reason we know why he died, and the reason we know that Chauvin kneeled on his neck for exactly 9 minutes and 29 seconds, was that the incident was videoed by a high school student named Darnella Frazier. As Frazier pointed her camera at the two men, Chauvin looked down at George Floyd, who gasped, "I can't breathe." And he pleaded with the officer, "Don't kill me." And he called for his mother. And finally, he became unconscious and his pleading stopped. Now, there are a few moments in the video, however, when Chauvin actually looked up, gazed directly at Frazier's camera with this kind of almost nonchalant expression. "You're enjoying it," said one witness, and can be heard saying on the video. "Your body language explains it." Now, there are other videos taken that day from other angles, by other witnesses, by the surveillance camera mounted outside a nearby Chinese restaurant, for example, and by other officers' body cams. But it was Fraser's video that remained the most widely circulated public document of this killing. And it was the moment in the video where Chauvin is looking up at the camera that appeared in newspapers around the world. This became the face of police brutality. This became the iconic picture of video surveillance. And the moment in the video that appeared in the newspapers really kind of summed up for people the whole issue of power between those who are trying to fight against police violence and the police themselves. There is no doubt that proliferation of video cameras in the hands of citizens has altered their relationship with the police, making incidents of police abuse like the one I just talked about more visible. And that's really important. It raises the hopes that the presence of these cameras might actually make the police more accountable for their actions. After years of allegations of police misconduct being dismissed because of lack of corroborating evidence. And this increased accountability might result in a kind of reorganization of the power dynamics between the police and the community. And much of the discussion around this new regime of visibility has focused on the power of the technology itself, the portable video camera embedded into nearly every cell phone sold today. The power of this camera to reverse the gaze, creating what Manuel Castells has referred to as counterpower. As I mentioned before, engineer and inventor Steve Mann, who you can see here, has famously used the term surveillance to describe the reversal of the gaze that's made possible by portable technology such as cell phones and wearable cameras. Surveillance, or valence from above, Mann argues, depends for its power upon being unobserved. Surveillance counters this power by making surveillance and those who practice it visible, and crucially, by making them aware that they are visible. For Mann, this is the key difference between surveillance and surveillance. While those involved in surveillance often seek to remain unobtrusive, those engaged in surveillance derive much of their power from making their presence known, with the aim not just of documenting abuses by authority figures, but of preventing them, based on the notion articulated by, among others, Michel Foucault, that the awareness of being visible inevitably alters people's behavior. But the degree to which making police officers aware of their visibility actually makes them more accountable is far from clear, as is dramatically illustrated by Officer Derek Chauvin, apparently with impunity, kneeling on George Floyd's neck. Before the witnesses gathered to watch the murder, and before the camera of Darnella Fraser, who was actually recording that incident quite openly. So it is far from clear. How these technologies are used depends on the interactional context in which they are deployed, and the ways their deployment alters these interactional contexts. So in other words, it's not the camera itself that, that confers power on the witnesses using it. Rather, it constitutes just one of a range of different tools with which people can negotiate power in interactions. Brock argues that most scholarship on the use of cameras so far has really focused on the camera. Yeah, it's focused on the technology of the video camera and its ability to document things. And this, she says, has resulted in impoverished analysis that really ignores the grounded practice of citizens actually using the camera. And so in contrast, she's urging us to focus on technologically mediated interactions as embodied practices, which unfold over time. And so from this perspective, the important question is not whether or not cameras make police more accountable, but how citizens and police use cameras to manage their visibility and to manage their accountability. Studies from other fields like sociology and criminology, for example, have shown how police and citizens actively attempt to control the ways cameras are used. Police, for example, have been found to use a variety of different strategies, sometimes trying to get people to stop recording them, often appealing to some nebulous law or regulation that supposedly prohibits it, and even going so far as forcing them to delete the footage or confiscating their cell phones. But a much more common strategy for police is altering their behavior when they're being filmed. Haggerty and Sadhu, for instance, describe how police officers are actually trained to repeatedly shout, "Stop resisting arrest," when they are filmed subduing subjects, whether the subjects are actually resisting arrest or not. Studies of citizens, on the other hand, have found that there's a similar attention to strategy. Rather than seeing their cameras as like objective witnesses, citizens actually use their cameras to actively make visible particularly aspects of what's occurring, and also to negotiate interactional power with the police, to say to the police, look, you're being watched. Brock argues, based on her fieldwork with activists involved in monitoring the police, that cop watching is a form of purposeful witnessing and embodied watching, in which the way participants manage their physical presence on the scene is just as important as the videos that they later share over social media. So from this perspective, technologies are seen not as causing accountability, but as part and parcel of the material orderings in which the production and consumption of accounts is substantiated. And accountability itself is seen not as an inevitable byproduct of visibility, but as a dynamic and contingent interactional accomplishment, something that needs to be continually negotiated over the course of citizens' encounters with police. It might be better to think of these negotiations in terms of what Erickson calls accountability, the capacity of different parties to create credible accounts of their activities and elicit accounts from others using whatever means are available, including what Garfinkel has called situated practices of looking and telling. So on the one hand, negotiating these encounters depends on who's doing the looking, who's being looked at, and how the roles of spectator and spectacle are distributed throughout the interaction. On the other hand, it also depends on these situated practices of looking and telling that Garfinkel refers to, by which people produce verbal accounts of their ongoing behavior to match those accounts with what is being made visible with the camera. The opportunities to engage in these practices, as I'll show, is, however, not equally distributed among citizens. They always unfold in the context of broader infrastructures of inequality and injustice. So accountability is also always a matter of negotiating and organizing the roles and responsibilities associated with looking and telling afforded to the different parties in the interaction, including interlocutors, involved third parties, uninvolved witnesses, and other present and non-present audiences that may be involved. So discussions on how people manage audiences in interactions from a sociolinguistic perspective, of course, usually begins with Alan Bell and his insights that people design their utterances based on the kinds of people they think are listening, and simultaneously use their utterances to design audiences as particular kinds of listeners. And situations as particular kinds of situations. The ways people alter their utterances for particular audiences, according to Bell, applies to all levels of language, including phonology, lexis, and grammar, and others have extended this to include broader discursive features of communication, such as politeness strategies, pragmatic particles, gestures, and even other forms of nonverbal communication, such as dress and hairstyle. Bell's model of audience design builds upon, as you know, the theory of communication accommodation advanced by Giles, which examines how people adjust how they speak, converging to the style of those they want to identify with and diverging from those they wish to distance themselves from. Interestingly, one of the main contexts in which Giles refined this theory was in interactions between citizens and police. Challenges for police officers and citizens in such interactions, he says, is to balance being non-accommodative, which might encourage aggression, with being too accommodative, which might seem insincere or encourage complacency. But such negotiations, of course, do not occur in a vacuum. Giles and his colleagues also found that factors like race of the individual involved in traffic stops and their past experience with the police had an effect on the way parties designed their utterances and managed mutual accommodation. These negotiations are even more complex when more than just two parties are involved. So Giles, for instance, says that the presence of third parties, for example, friends, sitting in the car, can complicate the situation, putting drivers who are stopped by the police in a kind of stylistic bind, having to perform both for the officer and for their friends who might think less of them if they're too accommodative to authority. And Bell calls this phenomena the auditor effect. Drawing on Goffman's concept of participation frameworks, he conceives of different kinds of audiences members positioned in concentric circles, radiating out from the speaker, going from addressee to auditor to overhearer, and finally eavesdropper, each having a different degree of influence on the way speakers design their utterances. In the case of the video recorded interactions that I'm going to be talking about, that third-party auditor is actually not present as a human audience, but embodied in the technology, which citizens actively deploy as an interactional resource, using it to manipulate the degree of awareness officers have of being audited by particular kinds of audiences, and the role the audiences have in the interaction, positioned sometimes as addressees, sometimes as auditors, sometimes as overhearers or eavesdroppers, can affect the way parties can be called upon to be accountable for their actions. As Garfinkel has pointed out, people's ability to account for their words and actions is really the basis of all social interaction. Accountability from this perspective is not just a matter of coming to a mutual understanding of what is acceptable in terms of behavior or speech in certain kinds of situations, but it develops dynamically within and as part of social situations. It is also not just a matter of language, but it also includes the physical ways that people make aspects of the situation, including their own behavior, observable and reportable. So obviously the presence of cameras alters this, and it alters what I have called elsewhere the infrastructures of accountability. So first of all, as I said, it provides opportunities for those holding the cameras to change the participation framework of the interaction, visibly introducing into the situation additional participants to whom officers and citizens are responsible for producing accounts. Second, it alters the organization of perception in the situation, giving those who are holding the cameras and those whose actions are being recorded new opportunities for making certain aspects of what's going on visible and thus meaningful. Finally, and probably most importantly, it provides ways for both parties to communicate to each other what aspects of the situation are subject to being accounted for. That is, what aspects of the situation count. While these infrastructures of accountability are constructed moment by participants as they negotiate their rights and responsibilities around looking and telling at different points in the interaction, they're also built upon a foundation of social relationships that inevitably involve historically sedimented forms of inequality, sets of expectations about who has the right to look and who has the right to be seen in different kinds of circumstances. And as we've seen in the case of George Floyd, it's often these regimes of power and visibility that are responsible for how particular interactions come to occur in the first place. Why a particular driver gets pulled over, for example, and what the consequences of the interaction will be after it's finished, whether or not the citizen or the officer faces criminal charges, whether or not the citizen ends up with the officer's neck pressed on his neck for his knee pressed on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So to illustrate these points, I'm going to analyze two examples. The first example involves an attorney who's moonlighting as an Uber driver. He's been pulled over by officers from the Wilmington, North Carolina Police Department. It happened in February of 2017. The driver, whose name is Jesse Bright, was transporting a passenger who had visited an address in a supposedly high crime neighborhood and was returning home. Upon being stopped, Bright was informed that his passenger was being arrested, at which point he began videoing the proceedings with his cell phone camera. This prompted one of the officers, Sergeant Kenneth Becker, to ask him to stop videoing, resulting in an extended argument between Bright and the officer, who insisted that videoing them was against the law. So I'm going to play this part of the interaction as it was filmed by Bright.
So I'm driving Uber, and my passenger's getting arrested.
Hey, Bob, turn that off, okay?
No, I'll keep recording, thank you. It's my right.
Don't record me, you got me?
I will look. You're a police officer on duty. I can record you. And if you come to this side of the vehicle, I can keep recording you.
Turn it off.
I can keep recording you.
Turn it off and take a jail.
For recording you, I'm sitting in my car holding my phone.
Record me.
What is the law?
Step out of the car.
What are you arresting me for? I'm sitting here in my car. I'm just recording in case anything happens. I'm surrounded by 5 police officers.
You're being a jerk.
I'm scared right now. I'm not being a jerk. I'm recording it in case anything happens.
Well, you better hope we don't find something in your car, okay?
They're not searching my car
Well, I'm going
because
to search your car.
you're not searching my car.
72 roll canine this way, please.
Bring the canines. I don't care, man.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
I know my rights.
I hope so. I know what the law is.
I know the law. I'm an attorney, so I would hope I know the law.
And an Uber driver?
And here, man.
And an Uber driver.
You want my bar card?
Turn on.
Shoes on, bud. Put your shoes on.
So the conventional way to address a situation like this is to see the camera as an auditor, objectively monitoring interactions in which the officer is the speaker and the driver is the addressee, or in which the driver is the speaker and the officer is the addressee. What I want to argue is how the camera gets designed as an auditor is actually much more complex and has consequences on how the speaker and recipient roles of the driver and the officer get constructed. Now, in this example, there are at least 4 ways the driver orients to the camera as an auditor. 2 are primarily verbal and 2 are primarily visual. The first is verbal commentary. So he speaks directly to the camera. The second is nonverbal commentary. And we saw that particularly at the end of that video, in which he covertly communicates with the audience using glances, facial expressions, sighs, this sort of thing. The third is what I call display, in which he communicates with his audience by pointing the phone at different parts of the scene. And the last is performance, in which he engages with the officer in conversation, which is also designed to be overheard by the camera, overheard by the non-present audience. One of the most interesting findings from the data of people filming their interactions with police that I've collected over the years is that in most of them, people spend most of their time pointing the cameras at themselves rather than at police. In this video, for example, it begins with the driver explaining to the camera that he's been stopped, the passenger is being arrested, briefly turning the camera outward to capture the scene before returning to his own face. Now, one purpose of the driver directly narrating what's occurring is that it allows him to control what Mirzoff refers to as the relationship between the seeable and the sayable, presenting a verbal account of the situation and choosing what aspects of the situation to make visible in order to confirm that account. An equally important purpose, though, is that by talking to his phone, the driver positions the officers as overhearers of the conversation, which to some degree is being performed for their benefit. The message such performances potentially send is twofold. First of all, they highlight for the officers the presence of the electronic auditor. And second, they make clear to them that they are being excluded from the production of an account of the incident. Of course, officers can also position drivers as overhearers by performing conversations with other officers or with other non-present participants through electronic devices of their own, such as here when the officer responds to the driver's intransigence by conspicuously using his walkie-talkie to call for drug-sniffing dogs to be deployed to the scene. Another important affordance for the driver is in directly addressing the camera, is that it creates an intimacy with non-present audience members who are invited to experience the incidents from his point of view. And in this regard, the camera is positioned not just as an addressee, but as a confidant, an ally, a positioning that's often accomplished by nonverbal commentary, such as here, for instance, head shaking and exasperated facial expressions. Another important way that the driver uses his camera is to point it outward, to show what the officer is doing. But these instances of display are not just to document the situation, they are pragmatic means. They function as warnings to the officer. Here, when the officer asks the driver not to record him, the driver momentarily keeps the camera focused on himself and then turns it to focus on the officer, tracking his movements from the passenger side of the vehicle to the driver's side, narrating his own actions as he's doing so, saying, I can record you if you come to this side of the vehicle, I can keep recording. Perhaps the most important moments, though, are those when the driver points the camera both at himself and at the officer and performs conversations that are meant to be overheard by the camera. In such cases, the accounts the parties give of their actions are intended both as responses to the interlocutor's challenge and as explanations for non-present witnesses who might watch the video later. In this exchange, both the driver and the officer produce justifications for their actions. So the driver asserts his right to record a police officer on duty. The officer claims falsely that it's against the law. But what's more important than these conflicting justifications is the lack of accommodation between the two parties, with the officer issuing bald on-record directives, using casual form of dress, hey bud, turn that off, step out of the car, as well as a threat, turn it off or I'm going to take you to jail, and the driver conspicuously refusing to comply by calling on the officer to account for his action. What's the law? What are you arresting me for? It's important to remember that in such interactions, at least from the point of view of the driver who is controlling the camera, they're also designed as performances, as I said, for these non-present audiences. And so the account the driver gives, I'm surrounded by 5 police officers, I'm scared right now, and the account that the officer gives, you're being a jerk, are intended both as responses to the interlocutor's challenges and as framing devices designed to shape the way non-present auditors might see the situation. So the driver's ongoing consciousness of the auditor and ongoing positioning of the auditor as an ally in his dispute with the authority figure is evident in his subsequent staging of performances designed to provoke the officers, to call them to account for both present actions and past statements, and to position himself as the reasonable party in the dispute. And as can be seen in the last example, not all officers are as skillful in giving accounts as they should be. This officer, for example, insists that filming is against the law, which it isn't. And so by attempting to resist performing, he actually ends up performing quite badly. Later, though, another more senior officer shows up and offers a performance that is more accommodative both to the driver and to his electronic auditor. So I'll play you this part of the video.
Mr. Bright,
Yes.
how long you been an Uber driver?
Mr. St. Pierre, a year and a half, 2 years
Okay.
maybe?
Have you been stopped a lot? It's probably why you've been stopped, because you're an Uber driver, right? Because there's a lot of history on the vehicle.
On this vehicle, there's history?
Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Okay. All right. So here's your license. We're going to wait for K9 because I don't know if he might have dumped something under the seat and you don't want us to look. So we're just going to have K9 come out and smell. And if they do an indication, if not, then you'll be on your way, okay, sir?
Okay. I mean, if he threw something under the seat, it still has nothing to do with me. Like,
Okay, but it's in your car. I'm not saying it has anything to do with you, sir. I've never said that, did I?
no,
I asked you a
I feel
simple
like
question.
something's going to be under the car and you're going to say, I'm the driver, it's my vehicle, I'm responsible.
Negative, sir. I've never said that to you.
Okay.
Okay?
Can you understand my frustration? I'm
Sure
just
I
at
do.
work.
I should.
I-
I absolutely do.
All
What's
right.
your registration? Just hold on a minute, okay?
Thanks, man.
All right.
So this excerpt begins with the officer approaching the driver and addressing him as Mr. Bright, a strategy that both communicates respect and calls the driver to account. Interestingly, the driver immediately answers by addressing the officer by his name, Mr. St. Pierre, which he apparently has read off the officer's badge, a move that both accommodates to the officer's new, more respectful tone, but also reminds him that he too is being held to account. In the conversation that follows, the officer attempts to account for the driver having been stopped, the driver reciprocating by offering his own account of his behavior, explaining his fear that he might be blamed for something the passenger left in the car. What's striking about this officer's response is the way he uses meta language to create a consensus with the driver about what exactly has been said. I never said that, did I? Negative, sir. I never said that to you. A consensus which the officer, of course, knows will be recorded by the driver's cell phone. Another important difference between this exchange and the earlier one is that the driver does not turn to look at the camera once, instead orienting his gaze towards the officer the entire time, and even appearing to be holding the phone at a lower, less obtrusive angle. In other words, rather than being used as a tool to challenge the officer or exclude him, the camera is positioned more as an objective witness. The second example I want to show you involves two African-American brothers, Benjamin and Ryan Brown. They were pulled over by officers of the Colorado Springs Police Force on March 25th, 2015, while driving through a predominantly white neighborhood, ostensibly for driving with a cracked windshield. The driver, Benjamin, was immediately asked to exit the vehicle and was placed in handcuffs, prompting his brother, Ryan, who is speaking in this video, to begin videoing the encounter from the passenger's seat. In the moments that followed, Ryan repeatedly asked the officers to explain why they were being arrested. In response to officers' requests that he produce his ID and exit the vehicle. So the officers finally open the passenger door, pull him out of the car, wrestle him to the ground, and all of this is captured on the video. Later, Benjamin Brown was charged with driving with an obstructed view, and Ryan with obstructing and resisting police officers. So I will play this for you.
What's the reason why you pulled us over, officer? I'm recording this. Police officers pulled us over for no reason. I got this on camera.
Do you have your ID?
I have my camera. I have my ID, and I'm recording this, just to let you know.
I'd like you to pass me your ID, please, and keep your hands where I can see.
Am I under arrest? You failed to identify yourself, so I don't know who you are.
Well, sir, you know I'm a police officer with the city of Colorado Springs.
You failed
I
to
asked for his
identify
ID.
yourself.
He would not cooperate. I just need your ID now.
You failed to identify yourself. My hands are visible. I have the recorder recording. My brother is being put in handcuffs. We're pulled over for no reason. He still had not identified why he's pulled us over. Now I'm being perceived as a threat because we're being pulled over for absolutely no reason. Am I being placed under arrest?
You're not under arrest.
What's the? I'm asking for the reason why we're being pulled over. You have still failed to identify why you have pulled us over.
I'm not pulling you. You're the passenger. Come on up.
Why are you pulling me out of my car, sir? Take your hands off of me. I have not did nothing. I have not did nothing. I have no weapons. I have no weapons. You have no reason to pull me out of the car. This is assault.
Turn around. Turn around. Turn around.
You see this? You see this? Excessive force.
So, as in the last video, the driver alternates between addressing the camera, providing a kind of verbal commentary, we're being pulled over for no reason, and addressing the officers in ways that demand that they account for their actions. What is the reason you pulled us over, officer? While in the video analyzed above, the driver did not at first explicitly alert the officers to the fact that he was recording until an officer actually told him to stop. In this example, the driver calls attention to the fact that he's recording immediately and repeatedly. I'm recording this. I have my camera. I'm recording this just to let you know. Using his cameras, therefore, as this kind of means to deliver a warning to the officers that they are being audited. Interestingly, though, as in the last video, he keeps the camera pointed at himself almost the whole time, rather than pointing it out the window at the officers. Now, of course, one reason for this might be that one of the officers is pointing his own more literal weapon, a taser. I don't know if you can see the taser. There it is, a taser in the direction of the passenger window. Rather than responding directly to this threat, however, the passenger continues to gaze in the direction of the camera and produces his own account of the officer's actions. I'm being perceived as a threat, while at the same time displaying for the camera his own stationary, non-threatening body. The only time he moves the camera away from his face is in response to the officer's directive to keep your hands where I can see them, to which the passenger both produces a verbal confirmation, my hands are visible, and turns his camera to document the visibility of his other hand. And at the same movement, managing also to document the fact that his brother is being put in handcuffs. Slightly over a minute after the passenger starts recording the interaction, one of the officers opens the passenger door, unbuckles Brown's shoulder strap, begins to pull him out of the vehicle, with the passenger continuing to ask the officer to account for why they're being pulled over and why he's being pulled out of his car. He manages to continue filming as the two officers wrestle him to the ground and press his face to the pavement. So again, here, the citizen designs the auditor as a witness through verbal commentary, narrating for the camera what's going on as it happens. We're being pulled over for obviously no reason. I'm being perceived as a threat. You have still failed to identify why you pulled us over. Why are you pulling me out of the car, sir? I have no weapons. Interestingly and maddeningly for this citizen, the officers simultaneously articulate a counter narrative in which they deny that any of this is actually going on, saying things like, you're not under arrest, I'm not pulling you over, speaking as the officer is pulling him from his car, claiming the right of the powerful to arrange the relationship between what is made visible and how it's verbally accounted for, to the point that the citizen's only recourse is to turn to the camera and say, you see this? You see this? This verbal counter account of events, which contradicts both the passenger's narrative and what appears to be actually happening, is reminiscent of Hagerty and Sanders' example of police shouting, "Stop resisting arrest," while beating citizens with their batons. It highlights the fact that the right to call someone to account depends not just on what the camera sees, but also who can claim the right to interpret what is happening, or as Mirzoff puts it, who can claim the right to arrange the relationship between the seeable and the sayable. So taken together, these two examples highlight a number of common strategies citizens use when deploying video cameras in their encounters with police. Perhaps one of the most interesting things is how in both videos, the citizens train their cameras on themselves much more than the police. Now, at first, this might seem counterintuitive. A perspective which takes into account the role of auditor design, however, helps to explain this. Of course, the most obvious advantages for citizens to film themselves is to create a document of their own behavior in order to counter future possible accusations of aggression or illegality. Equally important, though, is the fact that positioning the camera as an addressee gives them the opportunities to produce conversations designed to be overheard by officers, potentially heightening their sense of being scrutinized and excluded. At the same time, of course, the camera is also used to document the actions of police, and this is done selectively in ways that give the citizens control over what aspects of the situation are observable and reportable. Pointing the camera outward, however, is also a communicative gesture through which citizens can direct speech acts, such as warnings, towards officers, which are designed to constrain the range of actions officers presumably can take. Finally, citizens often engage officers in performances that are designed to be overheard by the camera, in which both citizens and officers adjust their physical and verbal behavior to legitimize their respective accounts of the situation. But the most important thing to note, the most important thing to note is that the two different drivers did not have equal access to all of these strategies. The second driver, for example, is reluctant to point his camera directly up at the officer, perhaps because the officer is pointing a taser at him. At no point is the Caucasian driver ordered to keep his hands visible, whereas this is one of the first things the African-American passenger is asked to do. Using his own camera to document the visibility of his own hands in response to this. Perhaps the biggest difference, however, is the way the officers and the citizens negotiate the relationship between the seeable and the sayable. In the first example, officer and driver are able to negotiate a consensus account of the situation. In the second example, however, the passenger and the officers produce contradictory accounts, with the officers insisting that they are not doing things that they are clearly doing. This last point highlights one of the main reasons why technologies like cell phone cameras and the legal right to use them are not enough to make police accountable for their actions. The ability to make something visible is not enough. One must also have the ability to speak about it, to produce an account which others will regard as legitimate. And as many African Americans who have filmed encounters with police, some of them much more deadly than the one discussed here, know, this power is almost always afforded to the powerful, the police, their attorneys, the press, and politicians, rather than to the victims or witnesses of police violence. As Boyton puts it, as long as visual evidence of police brutality is interpreted through racialized ways of seeing, the practices of counter-surveillance and the discourse of filming the cops remains circumscribed within a larger cycle of repression and continues to reconfigure itself in ways that uphold the legitimacy of the police. And this is perhaps what is behind the unrepentant gaze that Derek Chauvin directs towards Darnella Fraser's camera as he takes the life of George Floyd. The belief, in this case, thankfully mistaken, that no matter how seeable his crime was, the apparatus of police power, which he wielded, would be able to retain control over how it would be seen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Johannes?
Yeah, I see we have a few questions already and lots of clapping. That was really great. Thank you so much, Rodney. Should we perhaps start with the questions from the chat?
Yeah, maybe Lyubov would like to post a question or two of the questions, maybe.
Maybe if you articulate them.
Yeah. Lyubov, would you like to open your mic and ask the question?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Just a moment. Hello, everybody. So I have several questions, and I want to ask, first of all, I would like to thank Rodney for a very fascinating talk. And my first question is as follows. According to your pattern of communication, the third party of communication is broken down into three categories. They are auditor, overhearers, and eavesdroppers. What is the principal difference between these categories from the theory of communication perspective? This is my first question, please.
Thank you so much for that question. So I'll ask you to think back to that chart that Alan Bell drew about the participation frameworks and those concentric circles that he created. And so from Bell's point of view, the main difference between an auditor, there are two main differences between an auditor, an overhearer, and an eavesdropper. And the first main difference is the legitimacy of that person as a legitimate participant in the conversation. So an auditor is a legitimate participant in the conversation. They presumably have a right to be in the conversation, although they are being not addressed. An overhearer, it's a more kind of neutral position. Yeah, you're not really part of the conversation, but you're not kind of left out. You're just kind of hanging around. You happen to be standing next to these people on the bus as they're having this conversation, and you overhear it. It's not your fault. And then the eavesdropper is someone who actually doesn't have a right, doesn't have a legitimate role in the conversation, and so is surreptitiously listening in on the conversation, and perhaps even through some kind of subterfuge of concealing themselves as they're listening in. Now, for Bell, and I think this is relevant to the way the drivers use their cameras. For Bell, the main thing is really the awareness, because Bell is interested in how these different participant roles actually are affecting the way people talk, right? And his thesis is that the further you get out in these concentric circles, the more awareness or the less awareness the person has of being audited, and so the less their communication is affected. So an auditor who is obviously present. And in the examples I gave, this would be, this would be the driver pointing the camera to the officer, right? There's the auditor, right? That has one particular kind of effect on the officer. The overhearer is when driver is talking to the officer. I'm just holding the camera here. The driver is talking to the officer, and the camera is kind of overhearing the conversation. And then the third example would be the camera as eavesdropper, where the driver is not making the camera conspicuous or visible. And we actually saw that in the first example in the second half, where the driver is, kind of holding the camera down. Actually, he's kind of holding it almost out on his lap, right? So the camera is kind of listening in, but not constructed as an overhearer. So the officer is not kind of aware of this overhearer being so present, although it may not be unconspicuous. He may know the camera's there, but it has this kind of moving towards the eavesdropper sort of position. And there are two things I can say about this from my perspective. First thing I can say is I think this idea that there's a kind of decline in awareness and a decline of importance, with eavesdroppers being less important, overhearers being moderately or neutrally important, and auditors being the most important. I think that's a bit simplistic. So I think one thing that my data shows is, for example, sometimes the overhearer can actually be designed to affect the way the officer speaks in just as strong a way as an auditor, right? But having other different kinds of effects. For example, making the officer feel excluded from the conversation, like, oh, here he's talking about what I'm doing, but I don't have a say in what I'm doing, right? Who is he talking to, right? And so this idea that there's this kind of decline of importance is, I think, a little bit too simplistic. And the second thing I'd like to say about this is that Bell says that eavesdroppers are totally unimportant because we don't have any awareness of them because they're eavesdropping. I would question that, because I think nowadays there is an assumption that we're being eavesdropped on in almost all situations, even when the eavesdropper is not visible or conspicuous. And so I think with digital technology such as this, there is almost always the assumption that we are being recorded. We are being, when we're using our computers, we are being tracked. When we're walking through the streets, we are being recorded, even if we don't know who's doing it, even if we can't identify them, or we can't point to the cameras. And this, I think, has had an overall effect on our behavior in the societies in which we live.
Can I just chip in here, because it relates exactly to that? Because I have the impression that the notion of eavesdropper is a bit too active for the role of big social media communities that can be mobilized through media platforms. And these are not eavesdroppers. I mean, it's about shitstorms happening, which are more or less triggered, engineered by such material, and these are active media participants in a public debate.
Yeah.
So I think we should have a notion as well about publicity in that sense.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because there's another process going on as well. So what I focused on in this talk was what's happening on the scene with the cameras and the police, but then that leads to this other process where the video actually is distributed on social media. And then those audiences members suddenly become kind of active participants in, for example, sharing, commenting upon, and sometimes even digitally enhancing or editing the videos. So I wrote a paper about the protests in Hong Kong, where there was a similar video of a police beating. And in that paper, I didn't analyze the videoing of the police beating. I analyzed what happened to it afterwards, and how sort of different Facebook groups and different communities took this very, very same video and actually changed it or interpreted it in very, very different ways, framed it in very different ways. And of course, it's not just the people on social media who have a role in this. It's also the mainstream media, right, that will pick these up and then tell their story about it. It's also the courts and the lawyers. So you will recall, and in Chuck Goodwin has a really wonderful paper called Professional Vision, where he analyzes that court case with Rodney King, who was beat by the police officers in Los Angeles. It led to the Los Angeles riots, and how the attorneys in that case took that video and they split it up into still images, and they drew circles and arrows on those still images to take a video which was clearly a video of police officers beating a poor defenseless Black man, and turning it into this account of the professional behavior of the police officers and how they were responding according to their training to different things that I was saying. So that's a really, really good point, that you've got to, when you're looking at videos like this, you've got to see that the life cycle of these videos and the audiences of these videos go on and can be very, very complex far later from these when these incidents actually occur. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I'd suggest we now have Alexandra's question, which is very close to this point, and then we'll see whether we have the time for Lyubov's and other questions, right? Alexandra.
I mean, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Hi, just showing face for a minute. I'm kind of semi or fully covered by, and I want to look at by this answer that you've just given now, because really my question is about this other process that you've talked about it now. But one little thing is, as you were putting ethnomethodology to such an excellent use, I was kind of thinking Bauman and Briggs for whatever reason, and so I'm just thinking that how does the awareness and the kind of the anticipation of this particular route itinerary that this video that is being recorded now is bound to take, how is the second guessing of those distribution practices actually affect the here and now, which might be a link, I suppose, between those two papers, but I definitely want to get to your other paper as well.
No, absolutely. That's also a really good point, because I talked about this, sort of auditor effect as Bell was envisioning it, where the auditor was a human being, right? And the presence of the auditor was changing the speech or behavior of the speaker in various ways. But the auditor that you have here with the camera is different in two ways. And the first way is that the auditor is not present, and so is not visible. Right? And that has important implications. But a second implication, which you rightly bring up, which is massively important, is that it is creating a document in a way that a human auditor cannot. I mean, a human auditor can create a memory. A human auditor can be a witness. A human auditor can, in the future, produce an account of what happened. But a video is a document. And so I think bringing up Bauman and Briggs is quite apt, because this is an act of intextualization. So it's not just an act of auditing, it's also an act of creating a text from that act of auditing. And Bauman and Briggs talk quite a lot about how the power of intextualization is quite important, right? The person who has the ability, the right to extract a text, to make a text out of reality, extract it from its situation, and to decide then where it's going to be recontextualized is massively important. I also think that because we are now quite familiar with this kind of thing, because there is a very strong media narrative around what happens to these texts, not just as they circulate over the internet, but then as they become relevant to court cases. For example, the case of Derek Chauvin, who was in the end thankfully convicted, right? That certainly does alter it. And so the act of taking out a camera then becomes also intertextual, right? Because it's not like I'm taking out a camera in order to record you. It's like, I'm taking out a camera, you remember, like Daniela Fraser did, and that cop got done. So you got to be careful, right? So just now taking out the camera invokes this, this chain of media narratives about the power of these cameras. Yeah. And so, you know, there is you know, convictions in this regard are incredibly important. And it is important to remember that actually the Derek Chauvin conviction was it was an aberration. It was really unusual for a cop actually to be convicted. And there are many, in fact, most cases of police brutality that have been documented quite clearly, where the police have not at all suffered any consequences for that. I mean, some quite horrific incidents. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm 1000% covered.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I see we're over the time. I would tend to close the discussion now so that we don't fizzle out, and take advantage of the moment to thank you very, very much for joining us. This was a very exciting and very telling and a very kind of visibilizing talk about, illuminating talk in that visible kind of sense about visibility in linguistic practice. Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll meet again. I mean, probably it will be only February, but we'll send out the latest information on the January slot very soon. No, January is, Stephanie, I'm totally wrong. So the next slot is, as we had scheduled, late January, a talk by Stephanie, and then we'll go on as was planned. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rodney.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Rodney.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.